Hello and welcome to this special edition of Premier Unbelievable. I'm John Nelson and today I'm joined by Rod Dreher, longtime cultural critic and author of several books including The Benedict Option, Live Not by Lies, and this new one, Living in Wonder. I'm going to be talking to Rod about Christianity after atheism and how we can cultivate lives of joy and wonder. Rod, welcome back to Unbelievable.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be back.
When I was walking here today, I was reminded of the opening line of George Orwell's 1984. It was a cold, bright day and the clock was striking 13. And obviously it's striking 13 because of the nanny state, the authoritarian big brother that has changed the nature of time itself. But that's only one of the two major dystopian visions that we find in the 20th century. There's also Aldous Huxley's sort of soft comfort dystopia in which we're all kind of intoxicated by pleasure. I wonder, as we think about the future of the West, which one of those visions do you think is closer to becoming true?
Well, John, this was part of the problem I was trying to solve a few years ago when I began working on my book, Live Not by Lies. In 2015, in the United States, people who had come to the U.S. to escape Soviet totalitarianism kept saying, it's starting to feel like what we left behind. And I was puzzled. I'm like, where are the gulags? Where are the secret police? And then, because my idea of totalitarianism was built on the Soviet Union and also on George Orwell.
Yeah.
But it was only after I started listening to them more and started investigating it myself that I realized, wait, we're not talking about Orwell here. We're talking about Huxley. I'll give you a specific example. I was in Budapest in Hungary doing research for the book, going between interviews with people who had been to prison under communism, Christian dissidents, that sort of thing. My interpreter was a young Hungarian woman, a Christian, and she said to me, I really struggle with my friends, even my Catholic friends. She's Catholic. When I tell them that my husband and I have been arguing, they say, well, you have to get a divorce. You have to be happy. And she said, I tell them, no, I am happy, but a happy life is not one that's without friction.
Yeah.
And I listened to her talk about it, and I looked at her finally and said, Anna, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. And she said, that's it. Where did you get that? Chapter 17 of Huxley. And so what you see in Brave New World, the totalitarianism that's presented there is one of comfort and safety and to be cared for. All you have to do is surrender all your liberties and everything is set. That is the great temptation now, not what Orwell saw, but what Huxley saw, where people willingly surrender their liberties for the sake of avoiding pain and anxiety.
Yeah, it reminds me of that scene where the protagonist in Brave New World is in this kind of zoo exhibit and he's reading the works of Shakespeare and he doesn't want this life of soft pleasure. He says something like, I want sin, I want death, I want love, I want pain and suffering.
I want God, he says.
Yeah.
This is when John the Savage is his name. He's taken before Mustafa Mond, who is the world controller for Europe. And unlike in 1984, where O'Brien tortures Winston Smith, Mond doesn't want to torture John. He just wants to know, what's wrong with you? Why wouldn't you come be part of what we have?
Yeah.
And Mustafa Mond describes their society as, quote, Christianity without tears. And John the Savage, who has only been raised on the works of Shakespeare outside of the civilization, he says, that's what's wrong with you people. You don't have enough tears here. And it's funny that you ask me about this right now, John, because been here in London this week. I met the the rock star Nick Cave. He came to one of my talks. And I didn't know a lot about Nick Cave. I remember him from my youth as like a punk singer. But we ended up having dinner, and it turns out that he's become a Christian. He's about my age. I'm 58. He may be a little older than I am. He became a Christian after his son died in an accident at age 15. And I ended up going back to my hotel after talking to him that night and listening to the album called Ghosteen he made in 2019 about this horrible event in his life. And there was a book called, I forget the name of it, but it's a book-length series of interviews about art and suffering and God. I was in my hotel room in Westminster crying my eyes out because this man, Nick Cave, gets it, how our God, we come to God through suffering and limitation, and we seek his mercy, and we seek to offer that mercy to others. And this is what I think has been a big part of the problem of the Christianity in which you and I were both raised. I don't know how you were raised, but just generally in our culture, it's more therapeutic. It's about learning how to be nice and happy and middle class and conformist, and it doesn't know how to deal with suffering. And we had better get back to the old way, the old rugged cross, as the hymn says, because that's the only way we'll be able to fight for our freedom, our religious freedom, and otherwise in this brave new world.
I mean, I'm thinking of theologians as you were talking about that, like Blaise Pascal, who really had an acute sense of the duality of man. There's something so exciting about that. To say that man is wretched and sinful is actually an incredibly positive vision, because it means that we have fallen from something. We've fallen from greatness, or, we
were created for God's glory.
Yeah, but also there's elements there of Soren Kierkegaard as well in your writings. I just wondered, who are your sort of key theological influences in thinking about this?
Well, Kierkegaard is a very important one. He, in one of his journals, I think it was, he said, everybody admires Jesus, but Jesus didn't call admirers. He called disciples. And you can tell the difference between an admirer and a disciple when it comes time to suffer. And this, I came to this later, after I had been to Moscow to interview people in Russia, Christian dissidents who had suffered. And I remember interviewing this elderly Russian Baptist pastor, and we're just off a Red Square in a cafe. When we finished the interview, we walk outside, the snow is starting to fall, and he looked at me in the eye. He was a short guy, looked up at me and said, "Go back to America and tell the church that if you're not prepared to suffer for your faith doesn't mean anything." And to hear a Russian Baptist who had been persecuted by the Soviet state, and also, I'm Eastern Orthodox, but the Russian Orthodox have made it very difficult for the Baptists in that country, that meant something. So Kierkegaard's, the point about suffering was hugely important to me, but also reading about Solzhenitsyn's writing, The Gulag Archipelago, talking about how the things he discovered, how he came to Christ in prison. People like, I forget his name, the Lutheran theologian, Richard Wurmbrand, who went through the Romanian Gulag. Things like that really, really matter. And I tell in the book, Live Not by Lies, I tell the story of this young man, Timo Kriška. He is 3 years old when communism ended, a Slovak photographer and filmmaker. And he became rather successful in his line of work, but felt empty. But he had privileges that his grandparents didn't have, because they grew up under communism. He decided to go do a series of portraits and interviews with elderly people, all Christians who had gone to prison and really paid a harsh price for their faith under communism. And I tell the story in Live Not by Lies, both in the book and in the film on angel.com, about how Timo Kriška regained a much deeper faith, or found a much deeper faith by talking to these people who had lost everything. And most of them, even after communism ended, they continued to live in poverty. They had had so much taken from them. But Timo realized how rich these people were when they had everything but God taken from them. It changed his life so much that now he's in seminary to become a Greek Catholic priest.
So it seems here, though, that we're already talking about two very different visions. I mean, there are Christians, living out their faith in communist Russia, but then there's also the kind of therapeutic church. Are you trying to sort of are you seeing the Western church as, in some sense, the situation of the Western church as comparable to Christians living out their faith in a communist regime?
It's dangerous to make that direct comparison because, I talked in the former communist countries to people who had actually been tortured for their faith. That doesn't happen here, and please God, may it never happen here. But the comparison is the same as the dystopias between Orwell and Huxley. Our trouble in the West is we're far too comfortable. In the U.S. about 20 years ago, a sociologist of religion, Christian Smith, came up with this fantastic term called moralistic therapeutic deism. He said that is the actual faith of young American Christians of whatever denomination. And he said it has 4 or 5 basic points. God is real. All God wants of you is to be nice to others and to play fair. And the only people who go to hell are people like Hitler, really bad people. And that's basically it. Be nice, be happy. But this you can see why this is appealing to people, but it's not the gospel. And Christian Smith, the sociologist, he himself is a practicing Catholic, and he said that this counterfeit gospel has conquered all of the churches. And we have to push back against it. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do with the Live Not by Lies project and other things I write, is to say, like, you know what, this isn't real Christianity. This is middle-class bourgeois escapism. And I'll tell you why it's important. I mean, not just for the sake of the salvation of our souls, but Hannah Arendt, the great German Jewish political philosopher, she wrote in 1951 a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she looked back at Germany and Russia, pre-Nazi Germany, pre-Bolshevik Russia, to try to figure out how did those nations succumb to totalitarianism. And one of the things she found was that the broad middle classes, they didn't necessarily want communism or Nazism, but they also didn't want to take the risks to trouble themselves and give up their comfort.
Yeah.
And I think that is clearly what we're seeing today. So many churches now, whether they're liberal churches or conservative churches theologically, they want so badly to be conformist and to be part of what I think is a crumbling order that they're ceasing to disciple young people and old people like me into what it really means to be Christian. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great martyr, taught his famous book, The Cost of Discipleship. That is what we are all called to, and that's what so many churches have forgotten today.
So you've called this a kind of soft totalitarianism. I mean, what are the visible signs of that soft totalitarianism in Western societies today?
I'll give you an example that's the first frames of my film of Live Not by Lies. It happened here in this country.
Yeah.
Isabel Vaughn Spruce, Catholic pro-life campaigner, being arrested by the police for praying silently inside her head near an abortion clinic. What? They're monitoring what's inside your head and arresting you for it? That's one example. We see in Britain how the free speech crisis, how you can be stopped by the police or visited by the police if you've made an unacceptable to the authorities comment about migration, things like that. This is not the gulag, right? But it's still a form of totalitarianism. It can also be more subtle too. You know, we've all had the experience in this country and in America and maybe even all across the West of the last 10 years as the great awakening has arrived. And this is what the people who escaped communism and came to America during the Cold War were seeing. When people felt that they had to silence themselves, to be quiet, to not speak up, to not share their opinion for fear they would lose their job or be set upon by a mob. This has happened within the structures of liberal democracy. But we didn't see it. Many of us didn't see it because we thought that totalitarianism was something that would have to happen in a fascist or a communist country. In fact, it has slowly crept into our way of thinking over here. Just the other night, I was in Cambridge visiting some friends, and there was a Jewish woman there from London. And when she realized that none of us were anti-Semitic, she almost had tears in her eyes. She said, I feel comfortable with you, and it's been a while since I felt comfortable being Jewish here in this free country.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, we all see on our reels, on Instagram and on social media, different examples of where free speech has been curtailed. But I wonder whether there is a kind of a selection bias that can sometimes take place in thinking that that the social media can amplify those cases to make it seem like we are losing free speech in this country altogether. I wonder how widespread you think these signs, how dangerous you think these signs of totalitarianism actually are.
Yeah, I should be careful not to overstep in speaking about the UK. I don't live here, but in the U.S., until fairly recently, the Trump's reelection, it became so difficult within institutions dominated by the left to say anything, because the lines were constantly shifting, and you didn't know what was permitted today, What was okay to say today, tomorrow could get you sent to human resources for re-education, or you could lose your job, or someone on social media could destroy you. And the thing to know is that wherever there were institutions in American life dominated by cultural and political liberals, you had within them a culture of soft totalitarianism. Soft in the sense that nobody was going to take you out back and give you a beating, but there would be consequences. And also soft because it was not about assuring the victory of the proletariat or the Aryan race, but about protecting the feelings of sacred victims. And this is absolutely undemocratic. And you can't have a proper liberal democracy if people are afraid that if they say what's on their mind, within reason, that they could lose their jobs or their businesses for it, or become pariahs in the community, or be kicked out of school. There was a famous case at the beginning of the Great Awakening at Yale University in Connecticut. You can see this on YouTube. A professor named Nicholas Christakis tried to engage, he's a liberal, right? He tried to engage on the campus quad a group of students, mostly students of color, but not only, about Halloween costumes. Nick Christakis' wife, Erica, these are both proper liberals. She had made the mistake of writing a directive to the students in the residential house saying, should the university really be telling adults, you students are adults, what Halloween costumes you can and can't wear? A mob of students gathered to demand the authorities step in and punish her and punish anyone who wears the wrong costume. What a shock that was to watch, because you felt like you're watching liberal democracy fail right here. There was Christakis out there, a baby boomer liberal, trying to have a reasonable dialogue with these young people, and they were shrieking at him. They were sobbing. They were cursing. It's incredible. And they were demanding authorities step in and silence people. It's just one episode, John, but this shows you the deeper crisis we're in. And it comes from several places. Hannah Arendt said that in The Origins of Totalitarianism, the number one factor that predicts a society is headed to totalitarianism is widespread loneliness and atomization. A more recent scholar, Matthias de Smet from Belgium, I think, has talked about the psychology of totalitarianism, and he has identified widespread anxiety and fear, sort of formless anxiety and fear, as contributing to it, as well as mass loneliness. You've just described life for people under the age of 30 in the West.
It brings to mind, I heard an interview with Douglas Murray a few years ago where he said that our generation is the first generation to live without a story. And I think there he's thinking of the meta-narrative of the Christian story within which most Western people were living. How important is story and the collapse of story to the fragmentation we're seeing in society?
Oh, you've nailed it. The late philosopher Alistair MacIntyre said you can't know what you are to do until you first know which story or stories you are a part of. And that's our problem now. We have forgotten the story of the Bible that informed a generation after generation for almost 2,000 years in the West. The Western civilization can be understood, I believe, as the story of the gospel being received and developed among specific peoples, the Celts, the French, Franks, the Italians, and so on, and the accumulation of that over history. That is our story. But we lost that, I believe. Probably the First World War was the moment, but we were building up to that. The American secular Jewish sociologist and social critic Philip Rieff, who died maybe 20 years ago, but in the mid-'60s, he wrote a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic, in which he, as a secularist, said that our culture has lost its authority, its sense of authority. And we are trying instead to build the first people in history to try to build or sustain a civilization without a controlling authority, a controlling narrative. By controlling narrative, he means something to which we can refer to for our shared sense of morality, of right and wrong. So he said the therapeutic, and he's speaking in a Freudian sense, is about our way of trying to deal with the anxiety that comes from the death of God. Now, I presume our listeners and viewers do not believe God has died, but in the West, especially in Western Europe and Britain, God is, for all intents and purposes, not part of the narrative that drives public life.
Yeah.
So you get to a point. I mean, just this morning, before I came to see you, I was on Times Radio and interviewed with Hugo Rifkin today. He quoted a tweet I'd sent out of me this morning standing in front of Westminster Abbey, photographed myself, a selfie, and I said, a civilization, if you can keep it. What did you mean by that? And I said, well, Westminster Abbey is a symbol of what Britain has been and what Britain still is. But if you're not willing to defend the story and the symbols that come out of the story, you will lose them. I was on the Chartres pilgrimage earlier this year, and every year 20,000 young people, average age 19, young Catholics, mostly French, walk 3 days from Paris, the center of Paris, to the Cathedral of Chartres, following an ancient pilgrim's path. They camp along the way, they sing hymns, they celebrate the Eucharist, they pray. And I talked to the kids in Paris there as they were starting out and said, why are you here? And the basic story was, our parents gave us nothing. We're looking for meaning, we're looking for purpose, transcendence, roots, we're looking for God. And they weren't getting it from their parents or grandparents. They decided to follow this ancient path to rediscover it. It was a beautiful thing because you know what, John? They weren't angry about it. They were traditionalists, but not angry. They were joyful because they had found Christ in the old ways.
I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because Philip Rieff, I think he talks about culture and anti-culture. And so, a culture is where you have a canon, and you pass down that canon of literature and art and music. And I think he talks about us living in an anti-cultural moment, that we've sort of looked back at our past and we're now in our university courses and so on, deconstructing that.
Yeah.
But it's difficult because the past of the West has not always been perfect.
Right.
So is there a place for elements of deconstruction within, for example, our education system?
Well, I hate the term to decolonize the curriculum. I think that's so ideological, and mostly it's about causing a great forgetting. We must always be prepared to acknowledge the sins and failings of our ancestors and of ourselves today. But we can do that within a general love and affection and sense of gratitude for what we've been given. And I think families learn to do this too. My late father was the biggest influence on my life. He for good and for ill. But I don't damn him for his failings because I'm grateful. I have this Christian sense, or a Christianized version of Roman pietas, a respect for the ancestors. I think this is a huge problem for the West as we become so detached from knowledge of and respect for the past that we adopt this ideological idea that if there was any flaw there, that we must damn them all. And this guy, have you heard of Renaud Camus? Yeah, Renaud Camus, a Frenchman in his, I think he's 79, left-wing atheist, gay, but he's been canceled in France because of his idea of the Great Replacement. And we don't have to get into the Great Replacement, but he told me when I interviewed him that the Great Replacement of French culture would only have been possible if it were preceded, as it was, by the Great Forgetting. And Camus is not a man of God, but he's a man of high culture. And he said 2 generations ago in France, the authorities decided to stop teaching the classics and stop demanding this of them. They instead wanted to deconstruct everything. And so now we as a people in France have forgotten who we are because not only have we forgotten who we were, but we've been taught to be completely suspicious and hostile to who we were.
Well, we've opened up the interview here with Rod Dreher. In a moment, we're going to be talking a bit more about the Quiet Revival and Rod's new book, Living in Wonder. But first, we need to take a short break. Make sure you're following us on social media. That's at UnbelievableFE on X and at Premier Unbelievable on Instagram, Facebook and YouTube if you're watching rather than just listening. And if you're enjoying the show, do leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Looking at the gap between what I was experiencing during frontline work and what I had been taught as feminist theory shook my faith in feminist theory. We seem to have just abandoned any effort to control men and to constrain male sexuality, which has to be constrained.
As you say so powerfully in this book, the whole sexual revolution has been a boon for caddish men. It's justified by contemporary liberal feminists as being something beneficial for women, but in fact those who have benefited the most are the ones who have the most contempt for women.
Yeah.
That's really interesting what you were saying about young people in France, because I was in Lyon earlier this year, and I went into a Catholic church with my friend, and it was full of young people praying. There wasn't a mass. They were adoring, the Blessed Sacrament. Wow. And I said to my friend, wait, I thought France was immensely secular. What's actually going on here? And he said, oh no, they're turning back to Christ. But he also caveated that by saying, but it's also a lot of right-wing politics as well. And we've had a Bible Society survey here, which has suggested that since COVID, church attendance has quadrupled amongst young people, young adults. And there's a lot of discussion about why that might be. But I mean, when you look at the sort of the return to Christianity, or this so-called quiet revival, do you think this is really just a turn to a kind of far-right politics, a return to nationalism, or is this a kind of spiritual hunger that we're seeing in society?
I think it could be a mixture of all of these things. I was in France earlier this year on a book tour right after Ash Wednesday, and all of the French Catholics I talked to were amazed that the churches for the first time in decades were full on Ash Wednesday. And as they all said, well, this is a work of the Holy Spirit, which it clearly is, but it's also fear of Islam. And I think there's a growing sense among the French public that we can't fight something with nothing. Secularism gives them nothing powerful with which to resist the demands and even the violence that comes from some Muslims. And they're realizing that if we are going to survive as a people, we need to go back to the roots that built this country, and our culture, which is Christianity. You can't have culture without cult. Now, inevitably, there will be some right-wing politics that get mixed up there. This worries me as someone of the political right, because I don't want the faith to be too entwined with politics. That said, when the only people who will speak out for controlling the borders, because mass migration is causing a lot of these problems, or who will speak out for religious liberty are politicians of the right, you shouldn't be surprised when Christians, young Christians, old Christians vote that way. I think, though, we're also talking about spiritual hunger. John, one of the most important moments when I was reporting this book, Living in Wonder, my most recent book, it came for me in Oxford. I was there at a conference in 2022. During a break, a young Anglican ordinand, 27 years old, Daniel Kim, approached me and said, looking at me in my 50s, and said, I bet you think the greatest threat to the church in our time is atheism and secularism. I said, sure. He said, it's not true for my generation. That's your generation. I said, what is it with your generation? He said, the occult. Like, really? What are you talking about? He went on to say that the new atheism is largely dead in his generation, Gen Z, as we say in America. But they're not necessarily turning to Christianity. Some are, but many others are reaching out to various forms of esoteric spirituality, tarot cards, crystals, even Wicca, even Satanism. And Daniel said to me, I know that after I'm ordained, I'll be dealing with this for the rest of my priesthood, but your generation and the boomers don't even know it. Well, he's right. I went back and did some research. It really is true. Psychedelic drug use is a big part of this quest for the transcendent and the mystical. People want to, that they sense is this all there is?
Yeah.
And look, we in the church, we have the answer for them. But if our idea of Christianity is just sort of bourgeois conformity, sitting there hearing a nice sermon that might wrap up with the 5 points, all of this is important, but people are seeking a more embodied experience of the Lord, and we have to be prepared to give it to them. We found too, I mentioned earlier, I'm Eastern Orthodox. I'm from South Louisiana originally and was living there during COVID. And we had a small Orthodox mission parish. We started to see during COVID more and more young people in their 20s showing up, even married couples. I remember asking this one married couple who came, we're like, glad to see you, but what brought you here? Because Eastern Orthodoxy is really weird for Louisiana, or the Bible Belt. And they told me something interesting. They said that COVID had terrified them about how fragile our civilization is. And they said, we realized that the sort of Christianity and discipleship, or lack of discipleship we were getting in our megachurch was not going to prepare us to suffer if everything fell apart. So they came looking for spiritual depth and spiritual rigor. And we find that since COVID, we're finding more and more young people are coming to Orthodoxy in America, especially young men, seeking out something serious, not just therapeutic in a cheap sense, but seeking a deeper healing that comes with embracing the old ways, with fasting, with liturgy, with praying with the body, and so forth.
In your book, you talk about a conservative evangelical man who comes to you and he is dying. And he comes to you and asks you to explain to him your Orthodox faith. And because I think he was looking for a sense of enchantment, also a sense that, we want something more. And I wonder whether this is why people are drawn to more traditional forms of worship. When I was in Oxford, I'd sometimes attend Pusey House. And to my surprise, this Anglo-Catholic congregation was full of American evangelicals who were really interested that, we could have sermons from the church fathers, and we could worship with such beauty and with smells and bells.
This is part of your inheritance too, right?
Yeah.
You want them to know.
Yeah. So, what was it that drew you eventually to Orthodoxy, and can you explain that sense of enchantment you feel with your faith?
Sure. Well, I should clarify something. The young evangelical man wasn't dying, but he was just spiritually, he felt like he was in a desert. He believed everything he was supposed to believe as an evangelical, but he was craving this sense of wonder. And he approached me. I told him about Orthodoxy. I invited him to church with me in Budapest. And last November, a year ago, he became Orthodox himself and moved back to America. But I was raised myself in the 1970s in small-town Louisiana. My family was Methodist, but only Easter and Christmas Methodist. The faith really wasn't a big part of our life. We didn't have to go to church because we already knew what God thought, and he thought just what we thought. That was my family's culture. And by the time I got to be a teenager, it didn't mean anything to me anymore. And I thought that Christianity was either the sort of middle-class conformism or it was TV evangelism, which was just crazy and anti-intellectual. My mother won a trip in a church contest in 1984 to Europe, a guided trip to Europe. She didn't want to go, but she knew that her 17-year-old son, me, really wanted to go to Paris and see the museums. So she sent me. I was the only teenager on a bus full of elderly American tourists. Well, we started in London. We crossed the channel on a hovercraft, which you might not even remember existed. And then the bus was making its way across France to Paris. But an hour outside of the city, we stopped at an old church. And I thought, oh, man, another old church. Do I happen to go in? I went in. It was the cathedral at Chartres. And I stood in the nave there looking up at this, one of the most glorious churches in all Christendom. I didn't know it existed. Nothing in my life, being raised in small-town America in the late 20th century, prepared me for the glory of God made manifest in the stones and the stained glass and the vaulted arches of Chartres. And I remember standing there in the labyrinth in the nave and just realizing, no, God is real and he wants me. All of my shallow teenage atheism just collapsed. I didn't walk out of that church as a reconverted Christian, but I was on a search. I was on a walk. that took me through a lot of twisting and turning through university, through reading Kierkegaard and others. And I eventually ended up becoming a Catholic after 8 or 9 years. The final straw was I'd already come to believe that the faith was real. That experience of wonder in Chartres just shattered me, and it went right past my intellection into my heart and began to open my mind to the gospel, to the propositions in the gospel. The final thing that did it, that bookended it, was being sent in, I think, 91 or 92 as a journalist to interview an elderly Catholic Monsignor who had been born in the 1890s. He was so old, almost 100 years old. Before he became a priest, in the middle of his life, he had been an artist and an art professor of some renown in America. And my journalist, my editor at the newspaper, wanted me to talk to him about that. So Monsignor Sanchez opens up the door to let me in, and he's like this little Yoda figure, but so gentle, with light peeling off of his face. And he told me his story. I know we don't have time to go into the whole thing here, but basically he had been raised in Guatemala. His mother was English. His father was a coffee planter. They sent him to the Ivy League in America to get his education, and he lost his faith. But he regained his faith in the middle of his life when he went back to Guatemala and had 2 extraordinary miracles. As that old man told me about the miracles where the priest held the host out, the host in which Sanchez didn't believe, there was a burst of light that came out, and he heard an audible voice say, "I have always loved you." And then there was a second miracle later that brought him to the priesthood. As this old man was telling me about this event that happened 50 or 60 years earlier, tears were going down his cheeks, like it had just happened the week before. And I'm sitting there realizing I'm sitting in front of a saint, and not just a saint, but a witness. I have to get serious about God. And it was then that I converted and accepted Christ fully. But the reason I say those are bookends, because Pope Benedict XVI once said that in our age of post-rationality, the best apologetics for the gospel aren't reasonable ones. It's not to say you shouldn't use reason, but that's not going to be the most effective. The best apologetics are the beauty that comes from the church and its saints, which is a form of incarnate moral beauty.
Yeah.
Dude, I lived that. That's what brought me to Christ, because they both Monsignor Sanchez and his miracles and his obvious holiness, and Chartres told me they opened my mind to considering the gospel. And I find this to be, it's not only have I lived it, but when I talk to other people who have come to know Christ, often you hear the same story.
It makes me think, I think it was Cranmer who said, what the heart loves, the volition wills, the mind justifies. We're often moved by experiences of beauty. I think beauty is such a wonderful way in, because it's invitational. It's not quite yet sort of the moral claims of goodness or the sort of sharp, divisive claims of truth, but it's something that draws us in.
But beauty, I have to say, beauty has to be anchored to something. The beauty, truth, and goodness is what we always say. Beauty that's not anchored to truth or goodness can deceive. I remember, John, seeing when I was at the university, the Leni Riefenstahl film Triumph of the Will about the Nazi Party Congress in Nuremberg in 1934, one of the great propaganda films of all time. It is a work of stunning visual aesthetic power in the service of ultimate evil. And I've always kept that in mind, like beauty alone does not suffice. It is one of God's attributes, but if it is separated from truth and goodness, it can deceive.
I think some people will be listening to this. Maybe they've taken psychedelic drugs and experienced an ego death, or they're exploring some alternative form of spirituality. And they will say, why do we need Christianity? Why is this path any better than any other one? I wonder what you would respond to them.
Well, I would first say I took psychedelic drugs when I was in university, working my way to Christ. And I talk about it in the book, Living in Wonder, and I kept it hidden only because I didn't want people to think that I recommended it. But it was part of my coming to God. I did have the ego death, and it brought me out of a deep depression and sort of semi-alcoholism that had come over me because of heartbreak, as usual, a girl. But But anyway, it did sort of turn me inside out and make me more aware of the presence of God, God everywhere present and filling all things. But I think I got lucky. The Lord spared me because I think that psychedelics can open us up to the demonic, which I take is very real. So I don't think people should use it, but I didn't want to make in the book this condemnation of it without letting people know, I've tried it, I understand its power, and I would warn you from it. But your question is, why do we need Christianity? The basic answer is because it's true. Christianity is true. God is real. Jesus Christ is who he said he was, and we can never fully be who God created us to be apart from him. It's not to say that there aren't parts of the truth in other religions, or that you must go into a church to experience God. You can have profound experiences with God in nature and in other ways. But all roads lead back to Christ if they are the straight path and the true path. And what I like to do, I'm not pushy about my faith. When I was a Catholic, so I first converted as a Catholic. I was a very strong and even triumphalistic Catholic for 13 years in my 20s and 30s. It'll shock you that a young intellectual man in his 20s was arrogant. But then I started writing about the abuse scandal, church sex abuse scandal in the early 2000s. And I always thought that if I had in my head the arguments for the faith, for the Catholic faith, my faith would withstand anything, and it wasn't true. I learned the limits of reason after 3 years of being immersed in just horrible poison and evil. It felt like I was trying to hold on to a cast iron skillet over a fire, and I could no longer believe in the Catholic truth claims. But I became Orthodox, not thinking I was going to get away from sin in church, but because from a Catholic theological point of view, the Orthodox have valid sacraments. And I also realized that the Orthodox way of seeing of enchantment is more in line with my own way of relating to God. But I tell you, I had to come into the Orthodox Church on my knees with my intellectual arrogance shattered. And I'm grateful to God for doing that. Losing my Catholic faith was one of the most painful things that ever happened to me. But it had to happen for me to get out of my head and realize that if we are saved at all, we are saved not by merely assenting to propositions, but by a living relationship with the truth made incarnate, the man God, Jesus of Nazareth.
So do you think Orthodoxy specifically holds more room for mystery?
Oh, absolutely.
And unanswered questions. In which ways does it do that?
Well, when I first went into an Orthodox church as a broken Catholic, I was living in Dallas, Texas then, and I started going there. I didn't even intend to convert, but I thought this is what I thought Catholicism was going to be when I became a Catholic, because I'd read so much about pre-Vatican II Catholicism and with its emphasis on mystery, and it's just not there in most modern American parishes. But the Orthodox Church is very, very liturgical. It believes that worship must involve the body, which is why you see so many icons, lots of incense and candles. And these are not to be, icons are not to be worshipped in and of themselves, but to put us in a mindset to receive to recognize that we're in the presence of the Holy Spirit. And Orthodoxy is very strong on its liturgy in another way. When I was writing my book, The Benedict Option, I came across a really excellent thin volume by a man named Paul Connerton. Paul Connerton was an anthropologist at Cambridge University. I think he was a Marxist, but he just set out to find out how it was that people who lived in traditional communities held on to their stories in modernity. And he must have investigated Christian communities, non-Christian communities, and he came up with a few lessons. One, people who do that, they A, have a sacred story. B, they tell that sacred story in a liturgical rite that doesn't vary. 3, when they participate in this rite, they have a shared sense of being taken outside of time. And 4th, they use their body in worship. And Connerton had this beautiful phrase. He said, it sediments the story into their bones. When I read that, I'm like, this is Orthodoxy. I mean, you can get this too in like high church Anglicanism and some forms of Catholicism. But I have found that for me to get myself out of my head and there so I can receive the Holy Spirit into my heart, I need all of these prompts because we're not just disembodied heads there to receive a lecture. We're there to worship with our heart, our mind, and our bodies. Orthodoxy keeps that straight in front of it, and it also doesn't have this Western habit of trying to define everything down. Now, that is both a gift and a curse in the West to have to,
Yeah.
what's that great line from Wordsworth? We murder to dissect. You have to kill the living thing so you can cut it apart and understand how it works. Orthodoxy is much more comfortable saying, we just don't know.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah. I think I really relate to a lot of this on a kind of social level, that I think there is a widespread hunger, a spiritual hunger for something more. But I think in some ways on the academic level, it seems that a kind of naturalism is still very much the sort of status quo in the universities today. So I think, for example, you open up your book Living in Wonder by talking about someone who's having strange experiences of UFOs.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And a lot of people would go, that's really weird, and I'm quite incredulous towards that. Yeah. I suppose what are some of the experiences you talk about in that book that would have would make a skeptic think, actually, maybe there is something more going on here than natural processes?
Well, I write in the book about a fairly recent book, the title of which is They Flew, F-L-E-W, by a historian at Yale University. Guy won the National Book Award, Carlos Eire, or is it Eire?
Yeah.
E-I-R-E. And he's a Catholic, and he went to look at the archives in the Counter-Reformation period in Spain and found that there were hundreds of testimonies, signed testimonials by scores of people who had seen priests and monks and nuns levitating during this period. We don't know why, and he doesn't offer a reason why, but Carlos Ari says there's no other area of historical inquiry in which we would disregard the signed testimony of so many people happening so often, except with religion and spirituality. And so there's that naturalistic bias you're talking about. Well, one thing I would suggest people do is read about Lourdes. The 19th century, there was a apparition of the Virgin Mary there, and there were healing springs. The Catholic Church is extremely good about documenting unexplained healings there at Lourdes, and there are like over 100 of them that cannot be explained except by the miraculous intervention of God. So that if that doesn't convince you, you have to start asking yourself, do you really want to be convinced?
Yeah.
Similarly, I have experienced this myself, but the presence of demons and the demonic. I tell a story in the book about going to visit friends in New York where they were a very strict Catholic family, but it turned out the wife had become possessed because, as they found out, her grandparents back in Italy had been occultists. And she was eventually delivered, but these are fancy Upper East Side Manhattan people. The husband's a stockbroker. When I visited them at their house, I saw the demon manifest through her, and then she was back to herself and said, I'm sorry, that wasn't me. I said, I know. So what do you do with that, right? But I think to end this, there's a story, and I bring this up in Living in Wonder, a story from the Michel Houellebecq novel Submission, came out in 2015, about France that is on the verge of turning to Islam. The protagonist, Francois, towards the end, he goes to Rocamadour, which is one of the ancient medieval pilgrimage sites in southwest France. He goes to pray before a statue of the Virgin and the Child. And during the Middle Ages, their kings and queens would go there. Everybody would go to Rocamadour. So he goes there too, this modern guy, to see, is there something there for me? On one of his visits, he has a mystical experience. And you think he's on the verge of converting. Then he convinces himself, no, it was something I ate. He leaves, returns to Paris, and makes a very cynical conversion to Islam. He doesn't believe, but he pretends to believe because it makes his life easy. The reason I put that story in my book, Living in Wonder, is because so many of us think that if I only saw a miracle, then I would believe. In fact, it's less about the ability to believe, but the willingness to believe, the courage to believe. And there are other stories too we could talk about, but that's basically it. We have a lot of people who tell themselves, if I only saw something that I would believe. I think that's they're rationalizing their fear of belief. And I know that because I was that guy in college. I wanted to believe in God, but I didn't want to give up my liberty.
It reminds me of a study in Dale Allison's book, Encountering Mystery, Religious Experience in a Secular Age, where I think they take 50 people and they ask them, how many of you have experienced loved ones after their death? And 2 of the 50 said, yes, well, we've had some sort of strange experience of our loved ones after death. They brought the same people back a few years later and prefaced their question by saying, just to let you know, it's completely normal and you're not insane if you have these experiences of loved ones after your death. Have any of you had those experiences? And with that caveat, over half of them said, yes, we have. And I wonder whether there is a lot that's going on. There's a lot of experiences that people are having that they don't necessarily want to talk about because it's not so culturally acceptable. Maybe that's changing.
Talk about it, John, but they're afraid to because they're afraid of being thought crazy.
Yeah.
The story you brought up a few minutes ago, it's the opening anecdote of Living in Wonder. I was contacted a few years ago through Twitter by a young Catholic guy in his 30s in America, very conservative Catholic guy, who told me, I need to talk to my priest, and I'm afraid he's going to think I'm crazy. To make a long story short, we did a Zoom call. This young man, growing up in New England as a teenager, was driving his pickup truck along, saw a UFO hovering over a field, stopped to stare at it, and said, I can't tell this to anybody. They'll think I'm crazy. Now, he comes from a New England culture, which is very puritanical, and like, we don't have no room for weirdness. So years go by. He's in law school in Chicago, studying at his table. He said a portal opened up on the bare wall of his kitchen, and through this portal came 2 shimmering humanoid beings made out of energy that was flowing like water. And they began to communicate with him telepathically, telling him, nothing important, just a bird's about to land on your windowsill. That happened. A car is about to backfire on the street. That happened. Then they disappeared. He was so frightened, he went to the hospital, demanded a blood test and a brain scan. He thought he was hallucinating. Well, he said these things kept coming back to him, like every few months. After he got married, his wife saw them too, and they would come accompanied by poltergeist things. And I said to him, because I have friends who are exorcists who've talked about this before, and I said to him, Nino, that's his name, Nino, did you ever pray? You're a Catholic. Did you ever pray when they showed up? Yes. What happened? Well, they would disappear. I said, didn't you think there might be something demonic there? He said, I never thought about that because I figured if they were demons, they would want to fight. I said, no, in fact, I've talked to exorcists who've had this experience before with people who've had so-called UFO encounters. Don't go to your priest, go to the archdiocesan exorcist. So he did. The exorcist said, yeah, we've seen this before. He said a few spiritual deliverance prayers over him. All of the visits stopped. And I ended up meeting Nino face-to-face when I went to Chicago next. And he said, and he was a super conservative guy, and I can see totally why he was afraid of this. But he said, those things made me think that it tried to pull me away from Christ, but in fact, they drove me closer to him. Well, I told his story. I led off with that instead of a conventional case of healing, which the second story is about a former junkie from the East End of London who was miraculously healed. But I wanted to go with the UFO thing because I wanted people to understand, my readers to understand, this world is so much weirder than we think, and we've got to be able to talk about it.
We need to take another break in a moment, but come back where my guest Rod Dreher will be unpacking his vision of the relationship between Christianity and politics. If you're new to the podcast, check out premierunbelievable.com, where you'll find more shows, debates, and resources. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. See you in just a moment.
Historians don't argue that something that happened only once in all of history is the most probable occurrence because somebody said it happened.
Unless there's an incredible evidence.
The incredible evidence is that Paul said
Not just
so?
that. Not just that. Where was the expectation of a Messiah rising again from the dead? Tell me that.
How many ancient Christian writings do we have by somebody who says in those writings that he saw Jesus. No.
No, this is my turn.
Let me finish.
Let me finish my point.
I'm answering your question.
You weren't answering
You
the
asked
question.
me my question.
Okay.
And
I'll
I'm
let you
answering
finish.
it.
All right,
Let's let Bob finish.
That was the exciting part when we arm wrestle.
So I want to talk to you, Rod, about politics as well, because it seems like there is something of a tension here. That on the one hand, you want to say that the West is Christian in its heritage, and then on the other hand, you don't want to you want to say that Christianity is not just this sort of middle class bourgeois religion. So what is Christianity and its relationship to the state in the West?
Only the big questions here on this podcast. Well, look, I moved to Europe 4 years ago from the U.S. I live in Budapest in Hungary, and I've always been interested in history, but living in Europe has given me a much greater visceral awareness of how much history matters. Christianity built the West. I mean, I think there's no two ways about it. And I don't say that in a triumphalistic way, but just in a normative, historical, descriptive way. We came out of Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Hebrew religion, i.e. through Christianity. And, reading a lot of Tom Holland, Peter Brown, and other scholars of the development of the church in the West has made me realize how much we today owe to Christianity, despite all of its problems, despite the wars of religion and all that. And as an Orthodox Christian, I'm still a man of the West, and I want to recognize the gifts that both Catholicism and Protestantism have given that have made my life what it is and made our life today what it is. I mean, I went to Pusey House whenever I'm in Oxford. I like to go there and go to Evensong, and I'm getting a chill just thinking about it now. That is one of the heights of Western civilization, right there on the street in Oxford. You can
Pusey House should stick that on their website.
No, you can walk in off the street, and there you are. But I think that we like to think of a separation between Christianity and life, but it's just not so. We are seeing empty churches all over Europe, and if we don't go to them, we're only ever one generation away from losing it. I think a few years ago when the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris caught on fire, I think that was an electrifying moment and sort of an apocalypse in the sense of unveiling for a lot of French Catholics. They had come to take that cathedral and what it stood for granted. It can't go away if you don't save it, if you don't commit to saving it, and not just in material historical preservationist terms, but in living the actual Christian life. There's no substitute for that. And one of the things that I learned that's probably one of the wisest things any politician has ever said, something I read or heard a few years ago by, of all people, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who is a Calvinist. Orban is such a hate figure in Western Europe and the U.S., but it's astonishing because he's, to read Western media about Viktor Orban and to live in Hungary is to see this massive cognitive dissonance. In any case, Orban said, people look to politicians for meaning. He said, I can't give you meaning. I'm a politician. I can give you things. Meaning he can pass laws to protect religious liberty or to make it easier for Christian schools, whatever, or subsidies. He said, but if the institutions that are supposed to provide meaning, families, churches, religious schools, arts organizations, and so forth, if they don't step into the space opened up by politics and do their work, then any good politics might do will collapse. And I think that's very, very true. In my country, in the United States, you had a whole generation in the 1980s and 1990s, the so-called religious right, who thought that things were basically okay with the church. And if we could just get political power and get judges in, we'd get all things sorted. You can look back at the sociological charts. People started leaving the Christian faith in 1991 when the religious right was more or less at its peak. of power. Because what I think they forgot to do was disciple their children. Or they came to, their children came to believe that to be a faithful Christian meant to be the Republican Party at prayer. And the left does the same thing too, I should say, the more progressive denominations. I think that I'm really worried about over-politicizing Christianity, but at the same time, I don't want to be this disembodied saint who, Paul Kingsnorth and I have long had these arguments about this. He keeps telling me, you have to stop fighting the culture war. Paul is a fellow Orthodox Christian. Stop fighting the culture war. Stop fighting the culture war. My idea is it's easy for you to say living in rural Ireland, and you don't have to deal with it. And Paul and his wife are great parents. They keep their devices, electronic devices, away from their kids. But most people in the world outside of rural Ireland are not living that way. And we have to stay involved with politics to some extent, if only to protect religious liberty and to fight for the common good, to fight for the right of the unborn to live, and so on and so forth.
I think here in the UK, the culture wars haven't taken the sort of stranglehold on our collective consciousness as they have maybe in America, and we sort of look at our cousins across the pond with some sort of slight bafflement, and we don't quite understand the relationship between Christianity and the government. It seems like some people are trying to kind of mandate a Christian morality and use politics as a tool to influence a Christian vision of society. Is that what you think the role of politics, or a Christian in politics, should be?
Well, see, you've come to a really difficult point here, and it's something I haven't worked out for myself. I guess I would call myself part of the post-liberal movement, in the sense that I think liberalism has largely failed. And by liberalism, I mean classical liberalism. And I believe that Professor Patrick Deneen, the University of Notre Dame scholar, had it right in his book called Why Liberalism Failed. Said it failed because it succeeded so well in liberating the choosing individual from any unchosen obligation. Well, we're there, but it turns out you can't actually run a society that way. And we have so many problems now because people are free to choose whatever they want to choose, but they don't know how to choose. We live in a condition that the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman called liquid modernity, where there's no one to tell you what to do or where to go. We used to be pilgrims going through life, following a particular well-trod path. We went together, we followed the same landmarks, going in the same directions, to the same conclusion. Now we're more like tourists. Do what you want to do, go where you want to go. It makes people miserable. So it turns out too that classical liberalism works because we had this ambient shared Christianity or biblical vision. Even if you didn't go to church, even if you didn't really believe in God, you had this sort of basic liberalism, the dignity of the individual, the value of the free speech and so forth. It came to you with your mother's milk. Tom Holland demonstrates this so well in his book Dominion, about how liberal secular society was built on Christianity, but it turns out it probably can't survive the loss of Christianity. Now, the problem is you see young people, and especially young people in America, the so-called Christian nationalists coming from the Calvinist hard right, who want a sort of theocracy. They're not going to get anywhere in America with that. You have some very niche Catholic intellectuals wanting what they call integralism, joining of church and state. That won't work either. You couldn't find 99 Catholics, or one Catholic in 100 who would agree to that. Nevertheless, we've got to do something because people are fragmenting. The culture is fragmenting in a way that's becoming, I fear, more and more violent. But this is where I think the churches have a role in actually re-evangelizing and discipling the culture, and not simply depending on gaining political power. Because even though I'm a Christian, I don't want to live in a state that's coercive about religion. So there's enough of a liberal there in me. Last point, though, so many liberals believe in the myth of what I call the myth of neutrality. Say, oh, no, we just want a neutral playing. No, it's not. It doesn't work that way. That you're smuggling in a lot of assumptions there about what constitutes neutrality. We've seen in America on the culture wars, whenever the left proposes some new innovation like transing children, if anybody on the right says, hang on, wait a minute, let's not do that. Like, why are you fighting the culture war, right-winger, you Christian bigot? It's like this is how this thing works. And our media, which is so dominated by the left, I know this because I've spent most of my career in newspapers and magazines, it just seems normal to them that the people resisting progress are fighting the culture war. They're just fighting a defensive war to hold what we have.
Yeah, it's as one of my professors, John Milbank, used to say, once there was no secular. We sort of take secularism for granted, but it's its own kind of metaphysical claim. Oh, it's baked in with metaphysical assumptions.
Oh, it is. And I found out recently that some young Catholics I know in France, who read my book, The Benedict Option, and decided to try to start a small Catholic community out in the countryside, just ordinary families living together, praying together. It was stopped by a French court because all of these baby boomers, secularists, said this is against laïcité. And they were basically used secularism as a strong religion to stop the liberty of these French Catholics to live together peaceably.
Yeah. I suppose you are one of the few people to articulate a distinctive vision of what Christian community could look like in the future. I was wondering for listeners who are unfamiliar with the Benedict option, what is the Benedict option, and is it more relevant now that people are starting to search spiritually again?
Yeah, it is. Well, I'll tell you what it's not, John. It's not Rod Dreher saying head for the hills, run away, because so many people have caricatured the book as that, people who did not read the book. The origins of the book came from the final paragraph of Alistair MacIntyre's 1982 book, After Virtue. MacIntyre talks about how we have lost in late modernity a way to the ground of our reason. So many of our arguments become unresolvable because we're arguing from different grounds. And he compared our time to the fall of the fall of the Western Roman Empire around the year 500, where civilization was falling apart. MacIntyre said we're waiting for a new and doubtless very different Saint Benedict. What he meant by that was Benedict of Nursia was a young Catholic man born in the year 480. That was 4 years after the last Roman emperor capitulated to the barbarians. He was raised in central Italy by a Christian family. They sent him down to Rome around the year 500 to finish his education. He gets there and finds the city is in total chaos. And he decides that if he stays there, he's probably going to lose his faith. He ends up living for 3 years in a cave in Subiaco, praying, fasting, reading scripture, asking God what to do with my life. When he came out, he ended up becoming a founder of, I think, 12 or 13 monasteries before he died in the year 547, just around Rome. What he did with his rule, it was just a simple book about how to live in disciplined Christian community. The Rule of St. Benedict is probably second only to the Bible in terms of being the most influential book in European history, because that rule became the guidebook that led to the explosion of monasticism in the early Middle Ages. They went to all the wild places where civilization had broken down. They established places where the Word of God was spoken, where the Eucharist was, where the liturgy was said, but they also helped the local people. They evangelized them, but also helped them learn practical skills. Yeah. They kept memory alive in their libraries by copying and recopying books, and they laid over the course of 300 or 400 years the groundwork for the rebirth of civilization in the West. Now, I liken our own time to the great forgetting of the fall of the Roman Empire. We may not see the material collapse, but we certainly have forgotten who we are as a people. And I propose that we lay people look to St. Benedict and the early Benedictines as a general example of how we can form Christian communities out of our own particular Christian traditions, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, out of our own circumstances, whether you're urban, suburban, or in the countryside, and just try to work out through trial and error ways that we can live in disciplined spiritual community as a way to raise our kids and inculcate the faith in them. What it isn't is a total withdrawal, but it's a partial withdrawal. And I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
I went to Norcia, which is the town of Nursia, where Benedict was born. It's now called Norcia. And there are monks there still, most of them American, who restarted the monastery that Napoleon closed. And I was talking to the monks there about all the people who come in. They get lots and lots of pilgrims who come in to hear the chants. They want to go to confession, get spiritual advice. And but the monks have to close the doors to the monastery so they can follow the Benedictine rule and go pray when it's time to pray, do Lectio Divina when it's time to do that, to work during that time. And one of the monks said to me that if we stayed open all the time to the public, then we would not be able to serve them as we're called to do. We have to have that time in retreat to rebuild ourselves spiritually through prayer, Bible reading, and so forth, so that when we open the doors, we can be for them who Christ wants us to be. Well, I think there's a principle for us lay Christians like that too. If we immerse ourselves totally in the secular world by not reading the Bible, by not withdrawing, by taking smartphones away from our kids or whatever, there's a million ways we can do that, then we too will become so immersed in the world that we won't really be able to be Christ for the world because we won't know who Christ is and who we are in Christ.
Yeah, it's almost a refrain in Matthew's gospel, isn't it? That Jesus withdrew and he spent time in the wilderness. I'm wondering, are there signs of a kind of first light or a kind of hopeful future in Britain, in Europe, in the United States? Are there glimpses of hope or moments where this Benedict option seems to be lived out in a really effective way?
Yeah. I think the quiet revival is real, and it's happening outside the gaze of the mainstream media. But one hears about it through podcasts like this, or on Twitter, on social media, or talking to friends. This is really hopeful. Going to the pilgrimage at Chartres, though I'm not even a Catholic, it gave me the most hope that I've had in a long time to see 20,000 young people praising God with true joy in their hearts, not the sort of cheerful, happy, clappy, but no, there was something deep going on there. I tell in the book, Live Not by Benedict option, about this great Catholic community called the Tipiloski. It means the usual suspect. It's kind of a joke based that was told by the saint, Saint Pier Giorgio Frassati, to whom they look to as a sort of a patron. They're just ordinary Catholics who built a classical school called the Scuola G.K. Chesterton. One of the founders of the community is the head of the Chesterton Society of Italy, so he loves Chesterton. And but they didn't wait for permission to start something. They just went out and did it. Yeah. And I think that is going to be the key now and going forward. If we, whatever our confession, if we sit around waiting for the official church leadership to give us permission or to lead us, probably not going to happen. So why not take advantage of our own rights and our own duties as Christians to be entrepreneurial, not to get outside the authority of the church, depending on your tradition, but be creative. Pope Benedict said that we have to be creative minorities. He was looking at post-Christian Europe and saying, we true Christians are a minority now, but that doesn't mean we should just throw up our hands and give up and wait for the end. We need to figure out how to be creative in serving Christ and bringing the gospel to others within our minority status. And I got to tell you, too, one of the things I learned about doing Live Not by Lies and interviewing these Christians who had suffered under communism for the faith, not one of them, John, thought they were ever going to live to see the end of communism. They did what they did because they stood under God's judgment, and they did this with their eyes on God. And that's what we need now. If we sit down and ask ourselves, are we going to succeed here? That's not the right attitude. I mean, you need to be as practical as you can to make it succeed, but keep your eye on God and don't fail to undertake that work of creative minority status as a Christian because it seems like a long shot. Last word, there's a guy named Alain Finkielkraut, a famous French intellectual, secular Jew, and he's become very, very sour and sad because he's a real small R Republican, and he's seen And he's also Jewish, so he's seen as Islamism and the values of the Republic are failing. He's become very dark. And we met in Paris a few years ago, and we talked about how much we admire the work of Michel Houellebecq, the French novelist, who's very diagnostic about the failures of Western culture. And I said to the professor, Professor, where do you find hope? He said, I have no hope. And he just said it in a very sad way. And I said, well, I do have hope, and my hope is in Jesus Christ. But please don't think I'm saying that to you in a shallow way like a TV evangelist.
Yeah.
I'm not an optimist in the short term, certainly, but I'm hopeful. And for us Christians, I told him, hope is the certitude that even if we have to suffer, even if we have to give our lives for the gospel, that it has ultimate meaning and there will be ultimate reward. And that's why we do it. He listened to me very respectfully, but then shrugged his shoulders, as the French do, and said, well, that's good for you Americans, but here in France, we don't believe in God. And it was a sad moment because I think he's a good man and a tormented man, but his lack of belief that there is a living, transcendent God who loves us and who can give meaning to our suffering and redeem our suffering, it's crushing him. Fortunately, there are young people in France who realized that they were given nothing. They were given stones by their parents and grandparents. They're now seeking out the living bread.
I think that's a very helpful distinction between optimism and hope, because sort of hope is rooted in something deeper, and it's not always optimistic. It's sometimes the hope is just for eternal life.
Yeah, were the martyrs
it's not
hopeful?
going to manifest. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
They were not optimistic. They were hopeful.
Yeah.
Did Dietrich Bonhoeffer go back to Germany because he was optimistic about how things would turn out? No, he went because he heard the hope of Christ in his heart.
Yeah. As we bring this interview to a close, I was wondering, what advice would you give to a Christian seeking to cultivate wonder? Because in the last couple of months, I've joined my church choir, which has been amazing, because, having that sense of community and participating in something beautiful, feeling like I'm sort of continuing this great sort of English choral tradition, which is really fun. And it's given me a huge sense of joy and sometimes a sense of wonder as well. What are the practical things that Christians can be doing to cultivate wonder in their everyday lives?
You are so blessed in this country, in your churches, your cathedrals. When I was in Chartres doing that story, I ran into an American Catholic priest who was there with a group of high school Catholic boys from Philadelphia. And before they had come to Paris, they had gone to one of the old French monasteries in Fontainebleau and spent a week there at a traditionalist monastery listening to the chants. And the priest said these boys are just overwhelmed. They had no idea that the faith could have such beauty within it because they grew up in America, right? And here in England, you don't have that problem. You have such beauty, such Christian beauty, material manifestations everywhere. And in the evensong we were talking about that you experience in prayer and in singing. Ian McGilchrist, who's one of my great heroes, the psychiatrist, who he has talked about how we have to reactivate the right hemisphere of our brains to perceive truth through re-engaging with poetry, with music, with art, with liturgy and prayer, because we in the West have become so stuck in our left hemisphere, which is very analytical. That only gives us a portion of the truth. Marshall McLuhan, I'm jumping all up, dropping so many names, but I want...
This is helpful.
Marshall McLuhan, the great Canadian media critic, who was a practicing Catholic, daily Mass Catholic, he said there are two ways of knowing, percept and concept. And this parallels Ian McGilchrist's model. The percept is the right hemisphere, what we have from direct experience. Concept is to make that abstract. We need both to live a fully human life. But, said McLuhan, everybody he knows who lost their faith did it by stopping prayer. In other words, prayer is the primary percept to which we form this connection with the living God. When your faith becomes so stultified as nothing but doctrine and reason, that's when you begin to wither. So I think, of course, prayer has to come first, daily prayer, but also experiencing beauty, the beauty that comes from the church. Through song, through making pilgrimages, these ancient pilgrimages. I went to Walsingham a few years ago for the first time, and It's incredible. And to think that
Yeah.
if you live in England and this is open to you, get on the road. You are so blessed in this country.
So that's the advice from Rod Dreher to our UK listeners: get on the road.
Get on the road.
Rod, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you about your new book, Living in Wonder. All of our listeners should be checking out your other books as well, The Benedict Option, Live Not by Lies. Thank you so much for joining us on Premier Unbelievable.
It's been a great pleasure. God bless you.